Yes, hello again. Yeah, hopefully the recording will work now. First announcement. Unfortunately, yeah, the talk today is due to illness cancelled. I hope that maybe next week or on Thursday, December the 7th, he can give the talk then, but I will then make a new announcement. Yeah, okay, but then let's go back to macroeconomics. And what we were talking about yesterday. Well, in the end, we talked about this nice little picture where I talked about how powerful are the capital or financial markets, and especially that we have had interest rate differentials before the introduction of the euro, and it is not very surprising because interest rates of government bonds are more or less the risk premium a government has to pay. So it is then something like a rating. What is the probability that I will get my money back if I give to some country my money? And then with the introduction of the euro, we see that these interest rate differentials have vanished. And how can we interpret this? This we can interpret that with the introduction of the euro, we have one risk premium over the whole eurozone. So that the risk premium of every member, every single country is the same. But if we look at the economic performance, is it realistic that the risk premium for Italy and Germany is just the same? Of course not. We have still different economic performances in these countries. But why do we have then the same interest rates? And this we can interpret that the capital markets believe that in case in some member country of the Eurozone is happening something bad, that then the other countries will step in and help these countries. Well, this is of course rational, but with the introduction of the euro, we explicitly said that it is forbidden to bail out another country. And this is the famous bailout clause. Well, this is just a rule. So how, in the end, we can interpret then that we have had these same interest rates within the Eurozone? This then more or less meant the capital markets didn't believe into this rule. That they just said, well, in case if it happens, you will skip this rule. Well, and what do we see then within the financial crisis? There was a bailout of especially Greece and in general south of the Eurozone. Remember also what I called the bazooka, the 2 times 500 billion money tenders in 2011, 2012 in order to rescue the Italian banking sector. When I went through all what we invented in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and also Ireland, because there, especially the housing market also drastically has collapsed within the financial crisis. So actually, we have to admit the capital markets were right. And this is always something which we find, that the capital markets quite powerful, and that it is not easy when we talk about rule setting for the economic framework. And for this, I want you to remember also when we went on from the magic square to further goals, then we talked about the so-called Maastricht criteria, and especially there we had a criterion that the member countries of the Eurozone are not allowed to have a higher deficit than 3%. And at this topic, I showed you this diagram here, and there we had that Germany failed with the introduction of the euro, the Maastricht criterion of deficit lower than 3%. What happened after that? Since we failed to since we failed this target, hopefully I have said this when we were talking about this. So the rule was then that Germany has to be punished for this. And what did we do? Then Germany just changed the rules. We are the most powerful country in the Eurozone, and so together with France and Greece, we just changed the rules so that we not were punished. Well, and then of course, actually in my view, then I think it is not very surprisingly that after that, all the other countries also didn't try to meet this deficit here. Well, why I'm talking about this? So here we have something where we, in the end, skipped the rule, the no bailout clause. Also in this case of the deficit criterion of 3%, we skipped this rule, and maybe you have heard it yesterday in the media. Where is it? Had something from our High Court decision that the change of the money which was raised within the Corona crisis in order to stabilize the German economy within the Corona crisis, the actual government took some of this money, 60 billion euros, in order to finance long-term investments due to change in our energy system and other infrastructure investments we are planning to do. And our High Court just said this is not allowed. And why is it not allowed? Well, in Germany, we have here in this article the so-called debt brake, that you aren't allowed to finance your investments via credits in general, only in case if you have a special situation like a natural catastrophe or a very serious economic crisis. But only then. And so taking out the money from the corona crisis in order to finance other things is now meant by the High Court that this is not allowed. So to speak, we are now in the first time. We introduced this in 2009, and after 15 years, we are at the first time in the situation where this rule really applies. And why is it the case? Well, we talked about this, about the very low interest rate level during the last 15 years. And since we had a very low interest rate level, the financial budget was not in the state in Germany that we really had problems to achieve this goal that we are financing ourselves not with credits. And now we have the case that we maybe need this money, and we will see if this rule holds. And maybe we should keep in mind that other two rules, which dealt more or less with the same topic, that we just skipped these rules in case when they had to be applied. So this will be very interesting in the next future what Germany is doing, because also there is a discussion to implement something like our national debt rule for the whole Eurozone. And of course, if we will skip maybe this rule, then of course there will be no rule for Europe. Okay, but now let's say a hard cut, because now we start with the, so to speak, theoretical part of this lecture. Now, we want to develop overall economic models in order to describe the whole economy. And as we talked about it in when we were talking about money demand, there I already started with the so-called Keynesian view. Then I introduced, depending on interest rates and on income, a money demand function. And then we were talking about the theory, quantity theory of money, where we have only a dependence on income, and that this view is more a neoclassical view. And what I will do now with you, that we, on the one side, we were talking about so-called the Keynesian theory. With this we start, and then we will talk also about the neoclassical view. And what you really have to keep in mind, all these theories are definitely logically built. So there is nothing wrong, so to speak, within these theories, because the hard part building an economic model is not the mathematics. Well, we will do also some little calculations within this lecture, but the hard part of the economic theory is to make good and realistic assumptions. And there we will see that we have very different assumptions. so the starting point of the both theories. How is the economy working? The assumptions for this are, yeah, quite different, and this you always have to keep in mind. And maybe in the exam later on in task C, after you have done some little calculations, I will pose a question within the model. Explain what happens if the government is choosing some economic policy measure. Maybe is starting to give out money to everybody. And then my question is, argue within one specific model. And then the answer is not what realistically happens, but what happens due to the assumptions we have made in this specific model. So, what is Keynesian economics about? Keynesian, the name comes from John Maynard Keynes, maybe the most famous economist in the first part of 20th century. Well, and what he has done was quite a revolution, because within the world economic crisis in the ends of the 20s and then beginning of the 30s of the 20th century, he argued more or less in the opposite way compared to the neoclassical way. What was the dominating theory, how an economy is working? And he has written one book, and this is called the so-called general theory of, I think, in employment and interest rates. Maybe you can have also sometime a look in this book. And well, and all his argumentation is not that the neoclassical or the classical market process of demand and supply, and then prices will change, and then we have the equality afterwards of demand and supply, isn't something which we see in the economy. But he was arguing that especially this price mechanism is not working that fast as the neoclassical view is assuming. So this model, what we are now developing, is a short run model. So our view is maybe within 1 year, maybe it applies for 2 years. And we make also the assumption that the economy is within a state where we are not at full capacity. So this would mean if there happens something, we are still able to increase production. Remember when we were talking about potential output within the boom, there we said, well, there can be also situations where we are then at full capacity and we cannot increase production anymore. And what we also assume is, and this is a very, very strong assumption, that all investment and consumption plans are fulfilled. So we are planning as private households to buy a new washing machine. Then this washing machine will be produced. Or as a company, we plan to invest in a new factory. Then the building and all this will be produced. So here I think you directly see that this is a really strong assumption. So from this, we then say that if consumption and investment plans are changing, then also the production side has to change. So only the supply side will adjust anything if we have changed our plans of investment and consumption. So this means that we have a demand-driven economy. Supply is following demand. So what we did not assume that there is only demand, but we just say, well, it's something like hen and egg, and here now we say the hen is first and the hen is demand. And then supply has to follow. And now the other very strong assumption is, how is supply following the demand? It is following like this, that we only change production, so to speak, quantity. The supply side is not adjusting prices. And of course, in a practical situation, when we think of, and this was also the argumentation of the example of Adam Smith, when we said overnight everybody has his money doubled, then the supply side just doubled prices. This is, of course, a realistic assumption that this will happen. But within this model, we said prices are fixed, that we are not adjusting prices. And then we can ask, well, is this really good, or can this really be a realistic assumption? And then we go, and this was the argumentation by Keynes, when we especially go to labor markets. And within the labor markets, labor is one of the most important production factors within our economy. Or if we take it in a philosophical way, in the end, always labor is the last production factor. Even to produce capital, we need, of course, also labor. And then if we go to the labor markets, what we then realistically find is that, of course, the prices in the labor markets, so the wages, of course, change over time, but they do not change very fast. Think also, right now we have the struggle within the union of the railway and the railway itself. So this always takes some time. And hopefully they will meet in some days or in some weeks, and then they make a contract that more or less wages within the railway sector will be at some level for the next year, for the next 2 years. So these price process, and this is a realistic assumption, within the labor market is quite slow. And then, again, within the short run, we can say, okay, let's build a model where we say that the main production factor within our economy, labor, that within this part of the economy, prices cannot adjust in the short run. So from this side, then we truly can argue that it is a quite okay assumption which we make here. Well, and at an extreme point, quite often within the theory, then you make very extreme assumptions. And then the extremest assumption is not only a slow adjustment process of wages, but let's see what does it mean within economy when prices overall cannot change. Because then, we get an understanding how an economy is working. Of course, we are not assuming that in the real world prices are fixed. But we want to see how this assumption then feed in or feed through this model and what does it mean. So again, demand driven, short run, fixed prices. So also in the following equations, which I show you in a minute, where we are building theoretically the model, there you won't find any P for prices. And why? Just not because there are no prices, but if they are fixed, then we can just say, well, they are 1. And so we don't need them anymore. Okay. So, and in the end, this then means that aggregate demand determines the equilibrium, so the outcome, the outcome in our model, in our economy, the level of production, the level of income. Well, if we now say we are coming from the demand side, then we just look what are the components of demand in our economy. And there, look back when we are talking what is GDP in an economy, then we said it is more or less consumption, investment, government expenditure, and we also added, when we were talking about GDP, the trade balance, exports minus imports. But in this case, in order to have an easier model, we just skip these dependencies with the other countries, because also all our argumentation will be still the same when we do not take this part into account at this state of the theory, because this would be at this state of the theory just only one number which we would add. Okay, then we make also an assumption about the dependence of consumption. And we say that consumption itself is a function of income, of Y. And remember, when we were talking about money especially, then we said if income is increasing, then we are planning more transactions, so we need more money. And this is more or less nothing else. If we have a richer society, then in general, these society will spend more in absolute values for consumption. And this is definitely a very realistic assumption. And there is also no difference between neoclassical and Keynesian view. So what is the more or less easiest way in order to model with an explicit function a positive dependence of consumption on income? Well, then we just can write down a linear function. And this linear function then has two components. One part doesn't depend on income. This is called the so-called autonomous consumption, because there we find no Y. And the other one is yeah, then our variable consumption depending on income and just linearly depending on income, and then the so-called marginal propensity to consume is the factor, though the slope of the line. And why marginal? Well, of course, if we have a linear function, then it means if we calculate the first derivative of our consumption function, this is just cy. And so this means what is the additional consumption if we raise income by 1 unit. And this hopefully you have heard in many, many other lectures. This is marginal costs, marginal revenue, marginal production, whatever. Mathematically, this is always just the first derivative of your function. Well, and yeah, then I want to make a warning, because also if you go to the internet and just ask the internet about the Keynesian model, then you find sometimes funny videos about, well, I'm starting to explain this model to you within 3 minutes or something like this. I think you have many platforms where it is stated that your professors are all explaining something, but it is not well explained and so on, and we can all this do much better. Well, you, after this lecture, then can say, was it a good lecture or not? But if I look at these short videos in the internet, then quite often there is missing something. Quite often they're not talking very much about the very important assumptions. And sometimes also there are mistakes. And especially this autonomous consumption is quite often then within the internet. This is interpreted as the existence minimum. So then within a macroeconomic model, they just take the microeconomic view, and then the argumentation is also if you have no income, still you have to eat, still you need some flat. So there is some expenditure you still have if you don't have any income. Well, and this has nothing to do with this model here, because we introduce this part C0 only because of the empirical finding that average consumption is decreasing if income is increasing. So what does it mean? This means if we go to the data, if we look at a time series how consumption is developing, then we find that the richer an economy is, the part of its GDP that is used for consumption, so that this part of total production will be less and less and less, so that we do not consume relatively that much if we are richer compared to a situation where we were poorer before. And this means average consumption, this would be just C consumption over total income. This is the consumption on average equals C0 over Y plus marginal consumption times Y over Y. Well, these two cancels. And now if we say Y is increasing, then of course this part here is decreasing. This is constant. So overall average consumption has to decrease. And this is more or less, the easiest way to model the empirical finding we have. Well, and hopefully this what I'm written down here, you have also seen at least in 2 other lectures before. Even with the same letters, only these letters are interpreted in another way. Let's say compare this with the cost function of a company. Then hopefully you have seen some diagrams like this, where you had average costs. Maybe you have not written down Y, but X for this. So X is your output. And then you had shown such a function, C of Y over Y. And then you have argued, well, in the beginning, this cost function is decreasing because of decreasing fixed costs per output. And this is more or less then here technically the same function which we have here. So this interpretation from a microeconomic view or from a single household view has nothing to do with the macroeconomic explanation why I'm using this function. Although it seems quite plausible, but this part here is just, we see from the aggregated time series that a poor country, if we go to a country in Africa, then you will find that the average consumption will be much higher than in our country. And remember, we have a average consumption of about 50–55%. And there you will have average consumption of 70–80% of GDP. Okay, and now we want to build together our model that we say, now from our assumption here, demand-driven economy, supply is following demand, that in equilibrium we have to equate income production with our demand. And demand we explicitly have formulated with this function. And now we want to discuss how an economy works if we make this starting point for our model. So all what we are doing now is, what does this mean for an economy if this equation holds? This is, so to speak, our full model. Well, let's ask what amount has this marginal propensity to consume. And there you can remember the circular flow when we looked at the private households. Then we said, well, we have more or less two decisions. How much do I want to consume and how much do I want to save? And then again, we go to the empirical time series. And for Germany, we roughly find that the savings rate is quite stable over time, over the last decades. And we find that the savings rate in Germany is around 11%. This, on the other way, means that the marginal propensity to consume is just 89%. Well, within Corona, we had some time where it was more or less forbidden for us to consume. We all had to stay at home. There we had also saving rates up to 16-17%. But the last 2 years, the saving rate came back down again at the long-term level we had before Corona. So what does it mean? Let's say we take 1,000 euro, and this means from additional 1,000 euro, we will spend 890 euros for consumption, and we will save 110 euros. And if we now write down, or if we now look graphically on this consumption function, then let's say autonomous consume should be 100, or in general, C0 plus Cy times Y. This is just the linear line. Then this part here is the cut on the vertical axis. If we write down on the vertical axis consumption and on the horizontal line income. And about this, hopefully, or not hopefully, because it is not compulsory, but when you have entered the tutorial, then you have started with some mathematics, and there you have dealt just with linear lines. And these linear lines we need now for describing our model. So C0 is just the part on the vertical axis, and Cy with Germany roughly 90%. This is then the slope of the line. So this line is just a little bit flatter than the diagonal of this quadrant if we start here at 0, and this line we will need also in a minute. So, and now we know how the consumption function looks like, and now we want to look directly at our model, which is just described by this single function plus investment plus G. And what we also assume is that in short term, investment is just a given number. And on short term, this is also a quite okay assumption, because in general, we think of investments will last a little bit longer, are on average medium term or long term decisions. And what we also assume is that the government just debates about their expenditure and then we have the decision. Well, sometimes, unfortunately, like yesterday, the decision was sacked by the High Court, and they said, well, it is against the law what you have decided in 2021. And we will see where do they find these 60 billion euros in the next weeks. Okay, so what we now want to draw is how does this function here looks like. Let's also take as an example from the former slide, we had here 100, then I do not take 89, let's say a consumption marginal propensity to consume of 0.9, and let's say investment should be 50 and government consumption also. How can I draw now this function here in our diagram? Just try to describe it. Where do I have to start and how then the function evolves? You can take also the numbers. Any idea? Yep. Okay. So we start somewhere here, let's say, and you say me what number I have to write at this point. 100? So this is the function. The 100 we had when we looked at the consumption function. But consumption is only one part of total income or total demand. So here we have this number, and this number. All these numbers do not depend on y. So if y is 0, this is the cut at the vertical axis. So we can write this at 200 plus 0.9 times y. So this is then just C0 plus I plus G is 200. And then, again, the slope is of course the same as before, because this is the only dependence we have within our model. So then we have here yd is C0 plus Cy y plus I plus G, or with these explicit numbers here, 200 plus 0.9 times y. Well, so this is then, so to speak, this part of our model. And now we look at the other side, this part of the model. How can I draw this equation in my diagram? look at the axis. Here we are writing down yd, and here we are writing down y. Oops. So we are looking for all points where yd is y. And yd we find on the vertical axis, and y we find on the horizontal axis. So if you remember school, there if you have drawn functions, you mostly wrote it like this, I think. F of x is x. Well, and we now have only to do or to identify which letter is now f and which letter is x. Well, we have on the vertical axis f of x, so this is then just yd, and our y is just our x here. So what we then have is we have just to draw the function f of x is x. This is yd and this is y. And how does look the function f of x is x? Well, this is a function 0 plus 1 times x. How do in general we describe a linear line? A plus bx. So a is 0 and b is 1. So where does our function start? Well, a is just the cut at the vertical axis. And if this is 0, we have to start here. B is the slope of our line. So it has to be a bit steeper than our aggregate demand function. So this is the function y equals yd. So these are then all possible equilibria where production meets demand or supply meets demand. And then we explicitly have given the demand function. So our equilibrium then has to be just the cut of these two lines. Of yd equals y and yd equals c0 plus cy times y plus I plus g. And this is it. On the next slide, oops, you find all this, described in a way with not my worst handwriting, but go through it at home. And oh, this I forgot also. This line is also called 45-degree line, since it is just the diagonal of the quadrant if both axes have the same units. Well, and quite often in other textbooks you find this just called the 45-degree line. I'm not really happy about this because, of course, if you write down a scale on the horizontal axis 100, 200, 300, on the vertical axis 10, 20, 30, 40, and then of course this is not a 45-degree line anymore. Because this statement that both axes has to be the same unit, this is not quite often written down in the textbooks. Anyway, in order to be complete. But what we also want now to discuss, and what you hopefully also have discussed when you discussed general market equilibrium, supply and demand, then supposed to be you talked about when I'm not in equilibrium, what will happen within the market. And then you have argued that then prices are starting to adjust in that way that you have a movement into the equilibrium. So this is a stable equilibrium. And therefore it is interesting to talk about it, because it would be not stable, then of course always when we just a little bit outside equilibrium, we are going anywhere, and then it would be not that interesting. So here also we have to talk about the stability of this equilibrium. And for this, we look at a situation when we are out of equilibrium. So let's start here. In this case, what do we have? Well, on the YDY line, so to speak, from the production side, we see that production is larger than our planned demand, consumption, investment, government expenditure. And now you have to be careful, because now you have to use our assumptions. And what do our assumptions say? Oops, where we are. Consumption and investment plans will be fulfilled. So what will happen is that in this case, the production side has to adjust. Well, what do I do? They have produced too much, inventory will rise, and in the next step, they therefore will reduce production. So we come to this point. Also on the vertical axis, we can just write down Y. So the same production level we have then here. But again, production level is compared to the demand function still too high. So again, we are adjusting and so on. So because of our assumptions, we will from the right have an adjustment process in the direction of the equilibrium. Well, and then we go to the other side. What we will find at this starting point, we have produced not enough goods for the planned consumption and investment. Again, assumption is we follow, so we start to increase. We reduce our inventory and we are starting to additionally produce goods. Again, going to the right, this is also our new production level. Again, still we do not meet demand. We're producing to less, so we have the same adjustment process from the left. So in the end, this equilibrium is stable from both sides. Yeah, and now we more or less have fully described our model, and now we want to apply our model for some economic policy. And here let's talk about one example we had in history: financial crisis. Production crashed in the world and also in Germany. And what we then invented in Germany was the so-called scrappage allowance. And actually, this idea almost all other countries in Europe then also applied after we have introduced it. I don't know if you remember it. Maybe you were 10 years or something like this at this time, but I think your parents. And what was it? Well, this scrappage allowance was that I get 2,500 euros. You got 2,500 euros if you buy a new car and gave away your old car. Well, and this did many people. So overall, this had an aggregated volume of 5 billion euros in Germany. And what we see, if we look at the time series of incoming orders, that we had a quite fast adjustment of orders in Germany after 2009. And also here, this you have already seen, this time series. We also had a very fast catch-up process due to such a program. Well, and there was, of course, some argumentation against it. Not that we are not buying new cars, because I get money for buying a new car. But the argumentation was, if I buy a new car, then I buy something else not. Maybe the new washing machine, maybe, what else could I think? Maybe a new sofa or something like this, because I have made a large investment in a new car, because I do not get a new car for 2,500 euros. I need some additional money. So the argumentation of many economists was, this is not a good idea, because nothing happens to the real economy. And here you see what kind of argumentation is this. This would be then a neoclassical argumentation. Well, there is many additional money within the economy, but the only thing what happens is that prices will rise. But now we are in our model, and we will see what happens now in our model if prices cannot adjust. Let's go to our diagram. Give me another 5 minutes. What happens if increase of government expenditure of delta G? Das heißt, this means we are increasing government expenditure in our example by 5 billion euros. What happens now in our diagram? Something has to change. Where do we find G? Well, we have here YD equals C0 plus CY times Y plus I plus G. And now this increases. Where do we find this also? We find this also here. C0 plus I plus G. Well, I have written it already down here. So our cut at the vertical axis just moves upwards. So our starting point is now here, plus delta G. The slope is not changing, so we get just a parallel shift. Of YD, and we end up with a new equilibrium output. Y increases. Well, of course, this is what we want to have, but now we have also to ask ourselves, since we have to put in our example, 5 billion euros, is the outcome more or less than 5 billion euros? If we would have only an outcome of 3 billion euros, then maybe it is not that good. It is not a good decision to invest, so to speak, 5 billion euros. And this process, how much increases income if we increase government expenditure, this we will do also here within our example. So let's assume the increase of government expenditure at a first step of 5 billion euros, and we have a marginal propensity to consume, quite realistic for Germany, of 0.9. So in the first step, we just government expenditure enters overall demand. We have a push of total income of delta G equals 5 billion euros. Equals 5. But if income has now increased by 5 billion euros, what happens? Well, we had this assumption that consumption is depending on income. Now we have C of Y. Then C increases by marginal propensity to consume, 0.9 times 5 is 4.5. This would be additional consumption. Oh, let's say this is C2. But consumption is also a component of income. Income is Y equals C plus I plus G. Now C has increased. So we obtain delta Y2 is also 4.5. Again, income has increased. Again, consumption increases by delta T3 equals 0.9 times 4.5 is 4.05. But again, this is again a component of income. So delta Y3 is also 4.05. And hopefully we have talked about money multipliers. You see that this is the same process. So in the end, we obtain delta Y is delta Y1 plus delta Y2 plus delta Y3 plus and so on. This is 5 plus 4.5 plus 4.05. Now we write our 4.5, 4.05 in this other way. This is 5 times 0.9 to the power of 0, since this is 1, plus 5 times 0.9 to the power of 1, plus 5 to the power times 0.9 to the power of 2. Take out 5, 0.9, 0.9 to 1, 0.9 to 2, and so on. What do we have? A geometric series. And we know this is a finite number given by 1 over 1 minus 0.9 equals 1 over 0.1 equals 10. So overall, delta y is 5 times 10 is 50. So we obtain a push by a factor of 10. We are putting in 5 billion euros, and what we get out, additional income of 50 billion euros. And so delta y over delta g is then 10, and this is the government expenditure multiplier. So an additional euro we put into our economy is increases total income by the government expenditure multiplier. Well, and this is in the end then, of course, here with this drastic assumption that prices do not adjust. Of course, in reality, prices will at least slightly adjust. So it is a question then, if I want to start such a program, is this government expenditure multiplier larger than 1? And it is in a, in a way larger than 1 that you really have an impact. So a fiscal multiplier of 1.01 doesn't help very much. And actually, when I was in the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors in 2008, then the government in Berlin asked us, well, we have some ideas to stabilize, to push the economy, but we have to know what is the fiscal multiplier in our country. And then a colleague and me, we sat down with our econometric models, and then we came out that roughly we have a multiplier, or we have the opinion that our multiplier is about 1.2, 1.3. So that it is a good idea to do this. And then in December 2008, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors went to Berlin, and some weeks later we had these programs I've shown you. And of course, other were also asked, and As I know it, nobody else, really tried to came out with a number. Because if you would have been wrong, then of course everybody would have said, "What have you given for an advice?" Okay, that it is for today, and then we further go on, and we will, to make our model hopefully more and more realistic.